It's Dee Dee on the spot.
Welcome to another episode of DD on the Spot. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Johnson. Before I get to our guests here today, I'd like to remind everyone to like and subscribe down below if you enjoy this content. We greatly appreciate it. We have Russell Foster coming to us all the way from the UK. He's the professor of circadian neuroscience, the director of the Nuffield Laboratory of Ophthalmology, and the head of the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute. Basically, everything about sleep this guy knows. Russell, great to have you on the show.
I'm delighted to be with you, Ryan.
Thank you. So why don't you give us a little bit of a backstory? What piqued your interest in sleep and what caused you to go down that field? What inspired you?
I've always been interested in circadian rhythms, these 24-hour body clocks, and how they regulate so many aspects of our biology, and particularly how those internal clocks, in a sense, the internal day, is regulated by the external world, and how the light-dark cycle sets the internal clock to the external world. And increasingly, as I sort of got into the biology of circadian rhythms, that naturally led to an interest in sleep. And I suppose, you know, as a biologist, it seems to be one of those amazing questions of why will we spend a third of our lives apparently doing nothing? And of course, you know, the answer is we're not doing nothing. We're doing huge amounts of stuff. And I suppose that's been the exciting thing for me. It's been discovering, you know, what we're doing for our third of our lives. And it's been largely ignored by much of neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when you were starting out, what was, you say, the most surprising fact that you found out when you were first learning about sleep?
Oh, I think it was the role of sleep in not only the consolidation of memory, essentially the retention of facts, but it was some beautiful data showing that whilst we're asleep, we're processing information. And I think anecdotally, we all have felt this. You know, you wake up in the morning after a good night of sleep and you've solved the problem you've been thinking about. And I think that's just so incredibly cool. You know, the brain is processing information and it's coming up with important solutions to complex problems in a brain that we think is shut off. And of course, it's not.
Absolutely. Like my dad always says, before you make an important decision, you always get a good night's sleep on it and you feel so much better in the morning. Is there a specific reason behind that? Why is it just your brain is kind of able to relax and just collect all the data while you're asleep?
I think that's a very good point. I think during the waking state, so much information is flowing in. And of course, you're moving through the world. You need to make an immediate response. So you don't have the capacity, as it were, to process the information fully. And so what you can do is essentially park the information. And I liken it to like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. These bits of a jigsaw puzzle have come in during the day. You've put them to one side, and then during sleep, you can start to put them into this partially made puzzle and do these pieces fit with your previous experiences, what you want to do tomorrow, what you're thinking about doing next year. And so you're putting these new bits of information into a semi-formed framework and then giving those new bits of information coherence.
Absolutely. And I'm super interested I'm a history major myself, so I'm super interested in the history of stuff. When it comes to the history of studying sleep, what was the main thing that they believed when they were first starting out as opposed to what they believe today? Was it very different what they thought the main reasons for sleep were?
I think that in the pre-industrial era, there was almost people sort of embraced sleep. They didn't understand it biologically, but they embraced it. If you think of the plays and the sonnets of Shakespeare, sleep, sleep, nature's soft nurse, why have I forsaken thee? And indeed, a contemporary of a contemporary of William Shakespeare was Thomas Dekker. And he said that sleep is the golden chain that binds our minds and our health together. And so they naturally saw the benefit of sleep. And as we went into the industrial era, and in a sense, the capacity to invade the night cheaply and safely, sleep was the first victim. And because we could apparently dispense with it, we felt that this was the right thing to do. And, you know, in the 80s, people would come into work and say, oh, I've done another all-nighter. And people would almost think this is like a badge of honor. Thank goodness the situation has changed and people now are beginning to embrace sleep again, as we did in the pre-industrial era.
Speaking of all-nighters, being a college student, I have had my fair share. Every once in a while I have done that. And what exactly goes on in the brain when it hasn't got enough sleep? I mean, I know I've seen stuff that describes it similar to sort of almost like a state of drunkenness. It's sort of like when you're driving, when you haven't had sleep, it's kind of almost like driving if you were impaired. So what is happening exactly to the brain when it's not getting enough rest that it needs?
So if it's not getting enough rest, I mean, the ability to process information begins to fall apart pretty quickly. And as we were just discussing, the capacity to come up with solutions to problems goes away. You forget information. But also the way you interact with others changes. So you become far less empathetic. You fail to pick up the social signals in others. And you become almost more impulsive as well. So, you go for that red stoplight when normally you wouldn't. And so that increase in impulsivity, that loss of empathy, and that failure to process information are some of the obvious and immediate effects of an impaired brain. But it goes beyond that. The tired brain will trigger hormonal mechanisms. And so, for example, tired people tend to have higher levels of the hunger hormone ghrelin and the satiation hormone leptin. So there's a very nice set of data showing how metabolic problems can arise from even relatively short periods of sleep disruption. And then, of course, long-term sleep disruption will affect the immune system, so it can be suppressive of the immune system, so you tend to have more infections, more susceptibility to colds, and long-term, a greater vulnerability to cancer. Some of the data coming out of Denmark, for example, has shown that long-term night shift workers, nurses in fact, have higher rates of colorectal cancer and breast cancer. So there are short-term immediate cognitive effects on brain function, and then with sustained sleep disruption, you get longer-term somatic and global health problems. And an area we've also been studying has shown that if you are vulnerable to mental illness, then sleep disruption can exacerbate some of the symptomology. And what's turned out to be very exciting is you can think of the sleep systems as a potential therapeutic target. Stabilize sleep-wake in individuals who are experiencing depression or hallucinatory experiences, and you can reduce the severity of the symptomology.
Wow, that's amazing. And I also was very interested in what usually after like an all-nighter, someone doesn't get a great amount of sleep. If they just get a proper amount of sleep the next day, most of the effects are gone. They're still not tired really the next day. They can really feel just as energized as if they had gotten enough sleep the previous night. Is there a reasoning behind that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is that we perhaps are the only species that can override the sort of the biological imperative to sleep, and we do it by activating the stress axis, and we're really good at that. And so essentially you can function, but you're functioning on stress, and probably you're seeking out additional stimulants. I think so many people who are tired, the second thing they'll do when they get up in the morning will be to seek out stimulants, whether that be caffeinated drinks, and if it's a really naughty, tired brain, it'll go for nicotine in cigarettes. But the problem with sort of caffeine in particular, if the day has been fueled by caffeine, then caffeine can remain in the body for very long periods of time. And so that'll then delay your ability to sleep at night. And so then there's a tendency to say, well, I'll take a sleeping tablet of some sort, or I'll use alcohol to sort of get off to sleep. And of course, what these agents are sedatives. They do not provide a biological mimic for sleep. So some of the really important stuff going on, memory consolidation in particular, can be hugely affected by sedatives like alcohol. So you then wake, the alarm clock is driving you out of bed, and you wake and you need more stimulants and therefore more sedatives in the evening. And this stimulant-sedative feedback loop is endemic across much of the developed and the developing world, and across all age groups. I was absolutely horrified to speak to a 13-year-old a few years ago, and I said to her, what's your sleep like? And she said, it's fine, it's wonderful. And I said, oh wow, what's the trick? Share it with your classmates here. And she said, oh, I just take my mother's sleeping tablets. Oh wow. And I said, does your mum know about this? And she said, oh yeah, it's no problem. And I said, okay, well, how do you manage the next day? And she said, it's not great, but after about 3 Red Bulls, I can get going. Wow. And so here's, with parental consent, a kid who's driving the waking day and sleep with stimulants and sedatives. positives. And, at 13, the brain is still forming, it's still making those connections, it's still plastic. And I do worry about the impact that will have on a developing brain.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to young people. They do tend to need more sleep than adults do. But one of the fascinating things that I discovered in some of my research that I was doing is that there's always that. It was sort of a myth to me before, but then I found out to be true that if you were trapped in, let's say, like a cave with no natural light for maybe a week, your body would naturally get back into its natural REM cycle where you would fall asleep when the sun goes down, you'd wake up when the sun comes up. Is there a reasoning behind that? Are we biologically predetermined to have a sleep schedule like that?
Yes, it's slightly different than as you describe it. But
Okay.
if you or I went down to a deep, dark cave, constant light and constant temperature, and this was done in Mammoth Cave, you would show a 24-hour period of sleep and wake. And that's largely driven by the internal circadian biological clock. And this clock keeps on ticking away. And of course, what it's phenomenal for is anticipating predictable events within the environment. It upregulates our biology in preparation for activity and downregulates aspects of our biology, metabolic rate, for example, core body temperature, in anticipation of sleep. However, for that internal clock to be of any use at all, it has to be set to the external world. And the classic mismatch for many of us is what's going on with jet lag. Essentially, the body clock and the sleep-wake cycle is not locked onto the new time zone yet. And we eventually move to the new time zone as a result of exposure to the light-dark cycle. And it's the light-dark cycle that provides this incredible cue to set the internal clock to the external world. And it's a mechanism we've been dissecting over the past 20 years or so. And what's truly remarkable is that the cells in the eye that allow us to make an image of our world, the rod and cone photoreceptors, are not required for the detection of light for the regulation of internal time. We discovered that there's a third photoreceptor system in the eye. Those cells that form the optic nerve are called the retinal ganglion cells, and they send their projections off into the brain. And about 1 out of every 100 of those ganglion cells are directly light sensitive. So we have a photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. So you've got the eye is doing two things. It's providing us with this extraordinary sense of space, an image of our world, but by the regulation of internal time, it's also providing us with our sense of time. And we've been studying and trying to help those individuals with severe eye disease, and indeed other individuals who've lost their eyes as a result of trauma or genetic disease, to try and find ways in which we can regulate their internal clock. And actually, one of the success stories is that by understanding how those new photoreceptors regulate the clock, we can use drugs to fool the brain into thinking it's seen light. And so we I think will have some quite exciting drugs in the next few years that we can make the lives of these individuals better.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. Just the stuff that they're coming up these days is incredible. But one of the things that most people don't talk about when it comes to sleep is that you can oversleep. And I heard that there was a study that said that the average life expectancy for people that get more than, I think it was like 9 hours or plus, is significantly lower than the people that get like a mean average of around like, anywhere in the 6 to 8 hour range. Is there a certain reasoning behind that? Does the brain sometimes take too much time to rest and then stuff happens?
There's a huge amount of mythology about how much sleep we need. And, people are saying, oh, you must have 8 hours. Well, that's not exactly true. And we'll get on to your long sleepers in a second. So some people may need 9 or perhaps even longer. And some people can get away with 6.5. It's rare to be able to really function properly on less than 6 hours sleep. And how do you know whether you're getting enough sleep? Well, it's quite straightforward. Do you need an alarm clock to wake you up in the morning? Do you feel lots of sort of grogginess and sort of sleep inertia for several, half an hour or so or longer when you wake up? Do you seek out those stimulants to make you more awake? And critically, does your sleep pattern change on a free day versus a work day? Do you oversleep at weekends? These are all signs that you're not getting enough sleep. The studies that were done on individuals suggesting that if you got 9 hours or so, your life expectancy would be decreased, did not control for the health condition of the individuals that were being studied. And of course, if you have a health problem, you tend to sleep more. And so it may well be that is an artifact of people with already existing health problems. So I think the key thing is you prioritize your individual sleep needs. And, you have to be a bit brave about it, because your sleep patterns might be very different from the person you're living with, the family that you find yourself in, or your friends. And so, for example, morning types, larks, find it really difficult because their social life interferes with their preferred sleep times. All the owls and the late types are saying, no, you've got to stay out, come on, you can't go to bed now. So they get chronically sleep deprived at the weekends. Whereas, of course, the owls, who like to go to bed late and get up late, get sleep deprived during the week when there's work or study.
Is there a biological reason why people could tend to maybe be more inclined to be a night owl as opposed to a morning person? Or is that just basically people just deciding to have that sort of type of sleep schedule?
No, that's a great question. There are 3 issues that decide whether you're a morning type or an evening type. First is genetics, then it's development, how old you are, and then it's when you see light. So we have a pretty good understanding of what makes the clock tick. And there are a bunch of genes and their protein products that interact to produce a 24-hour oscillation. And what's been found in humans is that subtle changes in some of those genes have been linked to morningness or eveningness. So you could say that by their contribution to our genes, our parents are still telling us what time to get up and go to bed. Yeah. The second thing is when you see light exposure. So morning light tends to advance the clock. You get up earlier. Evening light tends to delay the clock. You get up later. And we just published a study on university students all over the world. And what we expected to find is the brighter the light, let's say you're living in Australia versus Oxford or Holland, where the light levels are not as strong, we expected to see the brighter the light, the more of a morning person you were. We didn't find that at all. The key correlation was how much light you saw in the evening. And of course, it's the evening light that delays the clock and makes you get up later. So when you see light is really important. So if you're an extreme late type and you want to try and get up a bit early, what you can do is set the alarm clock and then, to an early time, and then get up and expose yourself to bright natural light outside or through a light box. And that will advance the clock and make it a bit easier to get up. So we've got genetics, when you see the light, and then development. So from the age of about 10, there's a tendency to want to go to bed later and later and later. And this peaks in males at around about 21, 22, and in females around about 19 and a half. And from that point, you then slowly move to a more morning position. So by the time you're in your mid-50s, early 60s, you're getting up and going to bed at about the time you got up and went to bed when you were 10, pre-puberty. And it looks like those changes in our sleep-wake timing, our morningness versus eveningness, are due to some of the hormones that are circulating around the body during puberty. But the point of the matter is that somebody in their late 50s will want to go to bed about 2 hours earlier on average than somebody in their late teens and early 20s. Wow. So, if asking a teenager to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning is a bit like asking a 55-year-old to get up at 5 in the morning. And that seems to be very real. But there are three interacting factors.
So I was going to ask, have there ever been studies done on people that live, in the extreme north, like people in Norway or Alaska where there's the midnight sun, and then they also have like months or times where there's no light at all? How does that affect their sleep overall? I know that there's a seasonal affective disorder sometimes that people can get because of lack of sunlight. What are some tips to maybe combat that if you live in an area? I mean, I'm in Minnesota, so we get very, very cold winters, and we have days in the winter where we'll only have about 10 hours or 8 hours of sunlight, so it can be really tough. What are some ways to combat that?
Well, it's very interesting in places like Tromsø in northern Norway, where, of course, they can have constant light for almost 2 months and constant dark for 2 months. In the winter months, they use light boxes. And in fact, I was talking to a friend recently who visited a family in Tromsø, and they have a light room. So the kids, I got up in the morning and they're sitting in a room with bright light, whereby they're setting their internal clock, because they recognize the fact that the clock starts to drift, and that beautiful alignment that you have with all of these sort of rhythmic processes, all occurring at the right time in the right sequence, then start to drift apart if you don't get that really robust exposure to light in the morning. It's a bit like sort of jet lag, and that's the sort of thing that happens when your clock starts to shift without the presence of light.
Now, I have a lot of health and fitness experts that come on here as well, and they mainly like to discuss sleep. For them is one of the most, if not the most important things when it comes to recovery, to building when they're done working out, and they have a lot of recovery for their muscles when they're sleeping.
Yeah.
But a lot of people sometimes don't get enough sleep. But when you're sleeping, and the rise in obesity, I think, is sleep could be a big part in that. But when it comes to sleep for recovery, how important is that?
Well, I think the obesity issue is extremely interesting, and some beautiful work from Ev Van Kouter and her group at the University of Chicago have shown, she did a classic experiment whereby she took healthy young males in their early 20s, and then one group were only allowed to sleep for about 4 hours every night, and then the other group could sleep up to 10 if they wanted it. And she did this over, I think it was a 5 or 6 day period, and then looked at hormone levels. And the hunger hormone, ghrelin, was up by something like 27%. The satiation hormone, leptin, had gone down by 17%. So there's a huge hormonal twist to making you more hungry. And she showed that by the end of that week, these healthy young males were eating 35 to 40% more calories, and particularly sugars. And their ability to clear sugar from the circulation, or glucose from the circulation, was bordering on the diabetic. So even relatively short periods of sleep disruption can make you hungry and consume, more carbohydrates and particularly the sugars. So yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting, and Ev argues, I think, quite strongly that part of the childhood obesity issue is, the shortened sleep that kids are getting and the greater access to food resources. And so it's a noxious combination. But you're quite right. I mean, there's also the rebuilding of metabolic pathways and also the clearance of toxins. So one other really interesting area that's emerged recently is, and from groups working on both animal models and humans, is that at night during sleep, misfolded proteins, which are called beta amyloids, are cleared from the brain and disposed of. But if you're sleep disrupted, then it's more difficult to clear these misfolded proteins, the beta amyloids. And of course, it's a buildup of beta amyloid within the brain that has been associated with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So there's now a suggestion that disrupted sleep can also predispose you to some of these neurodegenerative diseases. I don't think one would say that bad sleep is going to cause Alzheimer's or dementia, but it could be a significant contributing factor.
Absolutely. So I've always been interested in as well in that human sleep patterns are somewhat unique, especially to humans, because if you look at other types of animals, like I've visited farms with horses on them, and horses, when they sleep, they usually do 15-minute power naps just throughout the day, and they'll just be standing up. Or if you look at sharks in the ocean, they sleep while swimming with like one eye open, and some species do that. What makes human sleep so different than all those other types of animals? Is it just the way our biology is?
Oh, I think you again raise a brilliant question, because in a sense, the sleep patterns not only are different between different species because of the ecology that they're living in, but of course our sleep patterns change as we age, and this must reflect the varying demands that we expose ourselves to throughout development. So, for example, young babies, can sleep up to 16, 18 hours a day. And of course, they're experiencing this extraordinary, new environment where they're processing all this information. The brain is developing. And so the brain is doing, different things. As we age, we are experiencing, less novelty, and therefore perhaps don't need to spend quite as much time asleep. So I think that the changing patterns of sleep represent different ecological demands and also developmental processes.
When we're also talking about animals, I like to ask kind of like animals that are nocturnal, that hunt at night and sleep during the day, or even some people that are like that. Well, obviously people are kind of built in with the same type of biology, but animals that have nocturnal senses, are they just built with a different biology that just allows them to do that? Or is it more for them where they do it to survive, like you were talking about before?
Well, again, that's a fascinating set of questions. What's really interesting is that the body clock, and we talked about those patterns of clock gene expression that drives these 24-hour rhythms. If you looked at the master clock in my brain, a diurnal species, and a nocturnal species like a mouse, the clock genes will be very, very similar. So they're going up and going down at the same time, whether you're a night active or day active animal. And the decision about being nocturnal or diurnal seems to be downstream from the master clock. But understanding nocturnality and diurnality, I think, is also at the very heart of the complex nature of sleep. And so in evolution, there would have been a very early decision to be either a night active organism or a day active organism. Nature, selects for the specialist. And once you've sort of made that decision, as it were, to be day active or night active, it means you can function at one time of day, but be really impaired at another time of day. So you want to limit your movement within an environment to which you are poorly adapted. So perhaps the origins of sleep are very much in what specializations you've evolved to be active either in the day or active at the night. Once you've made that decision, then you have to think, okay, well, I've got all these important processes that I need to do. I need to consolidate memory. I need to clear toxins. I need to rebuild metabolic pathways. And those essential bits of physiology are then located into the appropriate time of the rest activity cycle. So what sleep is for me is essentially a period of physical inactivity which limits your exposure to a dangerous environment, and during which time you undertake critical biology that allows you to function optimally during the active phase. So I think sleep is not a single overarching function. During sleep, we perform lots and lots of different bits of biology. And of course, that biology can vary very much between different species. And that's why the sleep patterns between different species are so different.
And one of the big questions or topics I really wanted to cover is dreams. I mean, people have been having dreams ever since obviously since the dawn of time, and people have used dreams to sort of interpret events and sort of make life decisions. What is the reasoning behind dreams? I know a lot of people, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on that field, but when it comes to the study of dreams, has there been a close to a definitive answer as to what causes them and why they are what they are?
I think there's still a lot of debate about dreams. I have a particular view, and I feel quite strongly that dreams have no predictive value. They're not used to anticipate some ghastly, event within the environment. Essentially, I think it's the brain trying to make sense of its world, and we made that analogy with the jigsaw puzzle. Well, sometimes, of course, that bit of the jigsaw puzzle can be slotted into the right part of the puzzle, and it makes sense. But what the brain might also be doing is taking those bits into other areas, and you get these bizarre associations and these bizarre combinations. And of course, the sorts of dreams we have can be influenced by our emotional state, and indeed whether we've had trauma or not. But fundamentally, it's just an artifact of the brain trying to make sense of its world. And I'd kind of argue that if dreams were of such value, we would remember them much more easily. I mean, one of the fascinating things about dreams, unless you write them down very quickly when you've woken up, you forget them within a second. And you know you've had a dream, but you can't for the life of you remember what it was. Now, if they had real biological value, surely we would be remembering our dreams.
Now, there's also a very fascinating topic, lucid dreaming, where people claim that they're able, through either techniques that they use or just luck or chance, that they're able to know when they're in a dream, that they're able to know that it's a dream, so then they claim that they can do whatever they want really in that dream because they have the power and they have the imagination. Is there any scientific study that proves that people can, in fact, know when they're in a dream, or is that just something that you think that people could either have made up?
Well, what's emerged fairly recently, and it's truly fascinating, we tend to think of sleep as being a global brain event. You're either completely asleep or you're completely awake. But what's been discovered, in fact, by one of my colleagues here in Oxford, Vlad Vyazovsky, has shown that bits of the brain can actually go into sleep while you're awake and functioning. And so one can certainly imagine that you'll have different grades of sleep, if you like, and you could be conscious while some bits, other parts of the brain could be in a dream state, and therefore making those bizarre associations and trying to sort of make sense of the world which we interpret as a dream. So yeah, I think we can think of these different there's a sort of almost like a gradation, a sort of a rainbow of different states, and you can tap into a semi-sleep state but still be conscious, and it's of course associated with relaxation techniques and different mind states.
Now, I've heard overall that if you get your average 8 hours of sleep, which is what obviously people don't need as much or they could need less, but when you get that average, only a certain percentage of it is your body recovering and retaining memories and doing that type of stuff. Is there any way that people could, or any drugs that might be being worked on that might be able to isolate that so that for the entire sleep, because obviously if you're only using, let's say, like even 2 or 3 hours out of that 8-hour period to recover, is there anything that people could use that would then make that period last longer, or maybe they'd only have to be able to sleep 2 or 3 hours to get the same effects as 8 hours?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can start to mimic different sleep states. So, for example, slow-wave deep sleep can be induced by certain drugs and indeed certain frequencies of sound. And you can buy devices which can actually increase the amount of slow-wave sleep, for example. The problem is we don't really understand what slow-wave sleep versus REM sleep and the various cycling of REM and non-REM sleep throughout the sleep episode really represents. What people have done, of course, is wake people up during REM sleep, for example, when you've got this extraordinary paralysis, from the neck down, you're paralyzed, you can't do anything, and yet the brain activity is very, very small amplitude, very high frequency. It looks like you're awake, but you're asleep. But people can be woken up from that very distinctive electrical state, and they can be saying, well, what are you experiencing? And many people talk about dreaming and vivid and complicated dreams. When you do that to people who are experiencing slow wave sleep with a big rolling electrical activity, they sometimes report dreams, and in fact dreams can occur during slow wave sleep, but they're less complicated, and you tend not to remember dreams from that state. Now, what that could be, though, is an artifact of the fact that you're in very, very deep sleep. So it takes you a long time to wake up when somebody's waking you up and saying, what were you experiencing? What do you remember? Were you dreaming? And of course, you may be so groggy, there may be so much inertia that you actually, in the process of being woken up, you forget that you were actually dreaming. So we don't even really know which different stages of sleep are the most relevant for dreaming. We do know that certainly deep sleep has been associated with the release of certain hormones, some of the hormones from the hypothalamus in the brain, and that slow wave sleep can actually be changed. So we've been studying different patterns of sleep in individuals with mental illness. So if you have schizophrenia, for example, you have very little, if any, stage 4 deep sleep. And of course, people have tried to associate stage 4 deep sleep with memory consolidation and information processing. And of course, these are very much impaired in individuals with schizophrenia. But this is all correlation. And really what the exciting thing at the moment is lots of hardcore neuroscientists are coming in and beginning to move just beyond the EEG and sleep, and really understanding how the different brain circuits, how the different neurotransmitter systems, how all the different genes and their protein products are interacting to generate this immensely complicated stage of sleep.
Absolutely. Now, this is a problem that has affected a few of my friends and my college roommate, which was I found hilarious to be sometimes, but sleepwalking. What is the cause of sleepwalking, and what causes people to do stuff that they normally do? I mean, my older brother, one time, he showered with his clothes on when he was sleepwalking. Yeah. Just funny stuff like that. What is the main cause of that?
Well, I was a sleepwalker as a kid as well. Many are. And I guess there's two sorts of sleepwalking. One is REM behavioral disorder. Now that's, REM sleep. And I said that's when you're paralyzed. But there are individuals who don't have that paralysis, that what's called atonia during REM sleep. And in fact, they've murdered people. There was a famous case in Australia where a husband murdered his wife, and he was completely let off because it was shown that he had REM behavioral disorder. So he had no control. He was in these dreamlike states and could be mobile. And so perhaps part of the reason for the paralysis is that during REM sleep we are, doing this emotional processing, and it's actually a good idea not to allow us to move around. Most of us sleepwalk during deep sleep, slow wave sleep. It's sort of this bizarre state whereby you are kind of awake and kind of asleep, but you do act out certain behaviors. I mean, people have climbed out of windows. They've, done masses of different sorts of things. Most people grow out of it, and it's a feature of young children and adolescents. The exact mechanisms remain unclear.
Oh, wow.
Which is true for so much sleep.
Yeah. So is the rumor true that you shouldn't wake up someone who's sleepwalking?
I think that the tendency has been to guide them gently back to bed and keep them quiet and keep them relaxed rather than wake them up. I don't think there's very much really good evidence suggesting that you're going to do any major harm. But I think the consensus is, well, let's just, be kind and gentle and guide people back to sleep.
And I was going to ask you, the world's longest sleeper, I saw in the Guinness Book of World Records, there was a guy who lived in a Eastern Asian country. I forget what it was, but he claimed that he didn't get a wink of sleep for over like 30 years or something like that. But he finally got some sleep afterwards. But he was active. He did a lot of things. He was healthy. And then he just claimed he didn't get some sleep. And apparently people believe that. But could there be a certain genetic type that would allow you to have not just no sleep at all, but maybe to have like a limited amount of sleep, maybe say like an hour or so a day and still be functioning? Is that something that could be possible?
I think I guess it's theoretically possible, but there would be impairment because of the things we've discussed. There are all those critical things going on in the brain. I mean, sleep is the best cognitive enhancer we've got. And our ability to do physical exercise, our ability to think is so profoundly influenced by sleep. So you might be able to get by with limited amounts of sleep, but you can't possibly expect peak performance. The other thing, of course, is that the tired brain is spectacularly good at deluding itself. And it's so tired it can't perceive how tired it is. And so unless I had that individual strapped to electrodes and I was really looking at the sleep, one can, we've all done it, I didn't sleep a wink last night. Well, actually, if you look at the records, you slept actually pretty well. So I think there could be some self-delusion here. I think, wasn't it Salvador Dali was the person who claimed he didn't sleep?
Yeah, something like that too, yep.
Oh, he didn't need sleep. And what he used to do was hold a spoon in his hand and then hold it above a metal plate. Mm-hmm. And when he fell to sleep, of course, his hand would relax. And so he dropped the spoon on the metal plate and that woke him up. But of course, his surreal and bizarre paintings could well have been an artifact of a brain that was chronically tired and really processing information in a very different, abnormal way. Produce great art, but but to function in the real world, driving a truck or a bus, maybe not so great.
Absolutely. I have a few more questions here before we wrap it up. But when it comes to people who haven't had sleep for a certain period of time, a lot of people describe like the second wind or even third winds that you can get. What is that exactly? Is that just a lot of stress and energy just coming to the brain that's already tired to make it sort of feel like you don't need sleep?
No, it's a really important point because there are two sorts of processes that are regulating sleep. There's the intuitive process, which is called the homeostatic drive or the sleep pressure. And the longer you've been awake, the greater the sleep need, the greater the sleep pressure. And then what you have is the circadian clock saying now is the biological clock saying now is the appropriate time to be awake and now is the appropriate time to be asleep. So if you've been up all night, what you're having to counteract is both high sleep pressure and the clock saying you should be asleep. But in the morning, when you are back home, although the sleep pressure is high, the body clock is saying, hang on, no, it's time you should be awake. And so you get a sensation of more alertness and greater drive because the clock is now driving much of our physiology to the wake state, even though that's to some extent being overridden by this big build-up of sleep pressure. But that second wave is due to the clock thinking, hang on, it's daytime, you should be awake, you should be more functional. And in fact, it's really interesting. If you look at cognitive performance, you see that it shows this beautiful, this change over time. And people who have been asleep longer, but at a different part of their biological 24-hour cycle, or actually show greater levels of alertness than people who think it's the middle of the night.
I've watched many documentaries on either athletes or war veterans recounting their stories, and they talk about how some nights or sometimes for weeks on time they'd probably get like an hour or two of sleep a night or no sleep at all. But then they describe once combat started or once the big sporting event started, all of their anxiety and buildup basically just caused them to feel normal, or just all of the adrenaline that they had. So is there a way that adrenaline can play when it comes to not having sleep, where it can just take over and for a moment of time, or for maybe like 3 hours or a sporting event, or maybe a firefight in combat just takes over? Is that possible?
Well, of course, that's how night shift workers survive. Because, of course, you can be 20 years on the night shift, but you don't shift your body clock to the demands of working at night. And you don't shift it, of course, because you're under low light in the factory or in the workplace. And then during the day, you experience bright natural light. And the clock always defers to the brighter light as the daytime signal. So what the night shift workers are having to do is override this sleep biology, and it's as a result of almost certainly as a result of activating the stress axis. So that's presumably what's also going on in athletes and particularly our military forces, who are often having to be awake for very long periods of time, and it's a great concern to the military. And short term, it's probably fine. But it's the long term where it becomes a problem. There are some issues though within the military, because if you're coming down, so you can start to hallucinate, and you can start to again be much more impulsive and start to do indulge in behaviors which lack judgment. And so some friendly fire, for example, in the first Gulf War, was associated with chronically sleep deprived individuals.
Wow. So lastly, I was going to ask, you're the director of the Nuffield Laboratory of Ophthalmology. What current studies are you guys working on when it comes to sleep?
Well, one of the areas that I've been fascinated in is the role of the eye in regulating the clock. And what we currently tell patients is, your visual system has damaged and you fail to see. And there are some people who've lost all of their visual cells, those rods and cones, but they retain those other cells within the eye, which can detect light for the regulation of internal time. And so, what we need to do is get the message out is, okay, so you may be visually blind, you may not be able to sense light, but those cells are still working, so you still need to seek out sufficient daytime light to regulate the internal clock. So, you're not spatially blind and temporally blind. And so we've been working on a range of different eye diseases, ranging from glaucoma to cataracts to age-related macular degeneration, and finding out the level of severity of those conditions and how they might affect sleep-wake, and then developing the appropriate guidance for those individuals. So it's a new dimension. It's really exciting because it represents a new dimension to clinical departments of ophthalmology. They're now advising clearly on vision, image detection, but also sleep and circadian rhythms.
Do you feel that there's an adequate amount of public interest when it comes to people wanting to become sleep doctors or wanting to get into the sleep field? Or do you think that that's something that more people should definitely look into?
Well, one of the things that we've established in the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute are educational packages. And we've developed the first fully online master's degree in sleep medicine. Why do we do that? Well, in a 5-year training, most medics will maybe have one lecture on sleep. And yet it's been estimated that for general practitioners, 30% of the problems they see in their patients are either directly or indirectly related to sleep. And they have no understanding of either the biology or what can be done about sleep correction. In teenagers, the constant problem of teenagers and their sleep biology. And what we have developed is educational packages for teenagers to inform them about the importance of sleep and why sleep is a fundamental part of our biology, what they can do, for example, in their bedroom to create a good sleep environment. But also the third thing is stress management and winding down. So I think for many people, their sleep biology is perfectly fine, but it's the stress management that seems to then override the normal biology. I was approached by a head of department here in Oxford, and he said, my life has fallen apart. I can't sleep. I'm getting more and more sleeping tablets from my doctor. I can't function during the day. What's gone wrong? And I sort of sat down and we dissected his life, and his sleep was fine. It just certainly happens there was a point in his life where things started falling apart, and he was just dealing with the stress inappropriately. So along with good sleep hygiene, good sleep education, you've got to have stress management as well. It's a complete package.
Now, I have two final questions here before we wrap it up. One of the things that growing up, my parents would always tell me, since my generation was the first to really grow up just in technology, technology plays a huge factor for me, especially when it comes to sleep. I mean, sometimes I'll admit I've been late at night on my computer or on my phone, and it causes me to go to bed sometimes around like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., but I've got it highly managed. But when it comes to that, is it because of the light source that you see all the time from the laptops and the computers? Because kids my age do tend to report sometimes higher instances of not being able to sleep due to their technology. Is it the light, or is there any other sources, and how would kids manage that?
Yeah. It's a really important question. And certainly high levels of light will increase levels of alertness and therefore delay sleep. However, those light-sensitive ganglion cells we talked about are relatively insensitive to light. And so it's teasing apart the light action versus the alerting action of what you're doing, the content of what you're doing. Now, a group at Harvard, led by a good friend Chuck Seisler, has looked at the impact of ebooks. And the experiment was 4 hours of ebook exposure on its brightest setting for 5 consecutive nights. And after 5 consecutive nights of 4 hours of ebook use, it only delayed sleep onset by 10 minutes. So, as one of my other colleagues said, it was statistically significant but biologically irrelevant. So I think we've got to have better studies here. I think as a rule of thumb, yes, minimize light exposure for half an hour before you go to bed. But the key thing is that you make the bedroom a haven for sleep. You turn off the internet, the social media, you don't have televisions in the room, and you basically develop those winding down protocols that relax you, whether it's listening to some relaxing music, whatever it is, but you start to disengage from the world. The problem, I mean, the internet and social media are amazing. It's fantastic, but they have the downside in that they can activate the brain at an inappropriate time. And we're really good at overriding the sleep systems because we want to do other stuff. And that's the problem with social media. And part of the sleep education that we gave to these teenagers in the UK was to be disciplined. Turn the social media off and don't be tempted. I remember when I first got my BlackBerry, years ago now, I went to Australia and I got this thing, and of course I would do the Australian emails, then I do the European emails, and then I do the North American emails, and this was madness. And so I was so my first strategy was to put the BlackBerry in another room. I put it in the sitting room, and then of course you're slightly jet lagged, and so you then think, oh well, I'll just go and check my emails, and I had no self discipline, so I left the damn thing in the lab, so I couldn't, and then I started sleeping well. And I think it's a really fascinating lesson for me. And there's some studies have been coming out of the University of Glasgow asking kids about their use of social media. And they know that it's keeping them up and it's a real problem. But the fact that they will miss out and not be connected with their world is absolutely horrifying to them. And of course, one of the further problems is that, of course, you go to bed late. You have to get out of bed early on a school day. So you're struggling with tiredness throughout the day. You get home from school and then you have a long nap. And of course, what the long nap does is push back the sleep pressure, which means you'll want to go biologically to sleep later that night. And so you can fall into a very dangerous routine of later and later nights, chronic tiredness during the day, getting home, having a longer and longer nap, which then is delaying sleep, and it can form a vicious loop. 20-minute naps, at least they shouldn't be closer than 4 hours before bedtime, are kind of okay according to the data. But if you can manage without naps, it's good. I mean, again, napping is a good sign that you're not getting enough sleep at night.
Now, lastly, what is your opinion on sleeping pills? Because I know it can be a controversial topic for some people. I mean, obviously, some people might need them in order to help adjust their sleep, but people can sort of abuse them, and they can be addictive to a point where you need to take more and more in order to get the same effects. What is your overall opinion on sleeping pills?
I think that sleeping pills can be useful in correcting a sleep-wake problem over a short period of time. And again, it may be due to anxiety or whatever. But I think, as you rightly point out, it's where they're used in a routine manner, and you need more, higher and higher levels. And in a sense, there's probably nothing wrong with the sleep biology. You just need to treat it right, and you need to deal with stress management and various other factors. And so it's doing the education and doing the basic behavioral change would always be my advice before you commit to some sort of medication, because after all, there is evidence that some of these sleeping tablets are actually impairing memory consolidation and the processing of information, so it can be deeply counterproductive. However, again, people mustn't get stressed about it. I think taking a sleeping tablet prescribed by your general practitioner for a short period of time to correct any abnormality, that's fine, but where it slides into consistent use is where the problem. And actually, many people self-medicate because some of the antihistamines that can pass the blood-brain barrier can be really effective sedatives. And indeed, some of the kids we talked to in this school were buying over-the-counter antihistamines, which you can do, and using those to self-medicate when they couldn't get hold of their parental alcohol. So my advice would be try and avoid medication and rely on your robust biology. For most people, the biology is intact, and you just need to make sure it's working properly.
I forgot one last question that I forgot that I was going to ask that one of my friends made sure that I wanted to ask, because I'm 24. I'm still in that age where I go out occasionally and have a couple of drinks, alcoholic drinks. What is the reasoning behind when you drink alcohol, maybe to a certain extent or even just a little bit of it, it tends to cause you to become drowsy or sleepy? Is that just the brain? Is it tricking the brain in any way, or what's the reasoning behind that?
It's essentially stimulating the relaxation centers, so you're feeling more relaxed, less stressed, and it feels great. And of course that's what alcohol does, and that's why a small amount of alcohol can be kind of useful occasionally, because it can relax you sufficiently to get you off to sleep, to let the natural biology kick in. But as you again have said, you'll end up taking more and more alcohol, and you become dependent upon it to initiate sleep, and high levels of alcohol will start to disrupt those important processes in the brain.
Absolutely. And I can't say, Russell, I cannot thank you enough for coming on this podcast. I mean, it was an absolute pleasure. I learned so much in and of myself, and I hope our audience out there learned everything, learned a lot more about sleep, because it is a third of your life, depending on how you count it. But people definitely need to know more about it in order to manage it, in order to live a more healthy and beneficial life. And Russell, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we shut her off here?
Well, no, Ryan, it's been great fun. Just to add, of course, I got some of my crucial training when I was a professor at the University of Virginia for almost 8 years, and I look back on my time in the States with immense affection and great gratitude because it's where I learned my craft. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I know that there's stuff that people can go and look up and research you, but is there any works in particular that you would recommend if anyone was more interested in finding out about your knowledge of sleep?
Well, we've written a couple of books, and there's one called Circadian Rhythms, a very short introduction by Oxford University Press, and that's by Foster and Kreitzman, and then another small book called Sleep, again a very short introduction. They're this sort of series by Steve Lockley and myself, Foster, and I think they provide a good, accessible introduction to both the mechanisms of sleep and then the special mechanisms that can generate our 24-hour body clocks, our circadian rhythms.
Absolutely. And I highly recommend, I'll leave links down below to all that stuff down below so people can go and check that stuff out if they're interested. And again, Russell, it was great having you on. More than happy to talk about sleep with you. I mean, it was a pleasure to have someone on that actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to stuff. We've had a lot of bands and health and fitness people on here, and sometimes you're like, I don't know if that's true. But with you, everything, I mean, we cannot thank you enough. And this, again, everyone, Russell Foster, go and look him up. He has a few videos on YouTube. He did a TED Talk, which was really cool that I watched. And just really overall, we can't thank you enough. And this is DD on the Spot. Ryan Johnson signing out. Have a great day, everyone.